We're going to deal with Lesson 5, the second group of lessons that have to do with Genesis for the lesson today. I wouldn't guarantee that that's exactly where we ought to be, but at any rate, we will follow up and try to get all of Genesis at least in while we're dealing with that part of the Bible. We've already seen, or at least if you've been following along in the Bible, we've already seen where Sarah dies, the wife of Abraham, and where Abraham arranges for her tomb, remember, by summoning Ephraim the Hittite, because he owned no land. A nomad owns no land, but he needed land for Sarah to be buried. He needed a permanent site, and so the cave of a cave was found on the land, and it became the burial place for Sarah. And then, when Abraham got to be an old man, he too, of course, died. The Bible also tells of his second marriage. A lot of people don't know that Abraham was married a second time to a woman named Keturah, and that he had a number of children through her. I think that as we study the Bible, that one of the things that we have to do, or that we need to do, is as best that we can at least to understand some of the customs of the day. It is not necessarily saying that we agree with those customs or that we would want to defend them, but that's simply the way people lived and had lived for centuries and would live for centuries afterwards, and customs, in some cases, they continue to influence our world today. People still live by those kinds of customs. For example, Abraham, Sarah was his wife. An important man like Abraham had a wife, but then he also had, we know at least of two of his concubines. Sarah had her handmaid Hagar, an Egyptian, given to Abraham. And then when a child is born, Ishmael, the child formally belonged to Sarah, but as a matter of biology, she was Ishmael was the son of Hagar. And then later on, when Sarah died, Abraham married again and had a second concubine named Keturah. But by definition, a concubine doesn't have the same status as a wife. And we'll see concubinage in the life of Jacob. And of course, as we read on in the Bible, somebody like David, a king, or Solomon had many, many hundreds of concubines. But a wife had a status that a concubine didn't have. And in practicality, in practical matters, that came out to be a matter of inheritance. The concubines' sons did not inherit with the sons of the wives. And so when Solomon married a king's daughter, an important personage, then she was his wife. Her children inherited, or her sons inherited with the rest of the sons of Solomon or of David. But whenever he simply saw somebody that he wanted to add to his harem, then she didn't have the status of a wife. And that was a common thing in the ancient world, and I think that's the way we would best understand Hagar, the handmaid of Sarah, an Egyptian, the Bible says. Now, the child belonged to Sarah, and Keturah had a number of children, and they are named in the Bible, but still, Keturah was a concubine. And then Abraham and Sarah both, while Sarah was alive, were disturbed by the fact that whenever they had grandchildren, that Esau was a grandchild of Abraham and of Sarah. And so Esau took a wife from the Canaanites, and so that displeased Abraham and Sarah, and so they didn't want Esau to inherit. Isaac, of course, would be the only heir of Abraham. Ishmael would not receive any inheritance at any rate. But Abraham and Sarah no doubt were concerned that that Isaac too might marry a Canaanite. And so the Bible gives, there's a long chapter in the Bible given to how Abraham has one of his servants. Well, it doesn't list a name at that point. Earlier in Genesis, we are told that Abraham had a slave that came from Damascus, Eliezer of Damascus. And I suppose that when he sent a son or a servant, a slave, one of his slaves, when Abraham sent one of his slaves back into Mesopotamia, across the Euphrates River, to obtain a wife for Isaac from his father's family that worshipped, as he worshipped, Yahweh, the God of Abraham. And so Eliezer brought back Rebekah, and she became the wife of Isaac. Now, Rebekah had the same problem, if that's the way you want to talk about it, that Sarah had, in that she too did not have children. She is said to be barren, as Sarah was. And so there was some time when there were no children born. But eventually, the Bible says that Isaac prayed for his wife, Rebekah, and she conceived twins. And the twins, it says, were fought even in the womb, that they were rivals even in the womb. I suppose they kicked around and thrashed around in the womb, so that she saw that they were not likely to get along. Esau, the word means red, as Edom means red. But Esau was born first. The Bible says that he was hairy, that he was dark complected. I suppose that's what it means when it says that he was red. I suppose that he was darker complected. I've seen children, maybe newly born children, that had a frock of hair. And so it may be that Esau was relatively hairy. And Jacob was born second. But he is said to be a man who liked to live in tents. He's sort of like I am, whose idea of roughness is sleeping at a Holiday Inn with the window open. Well, the idea of Jacob was a mild man, and he was favored by his mother Rebekah, and Esau was favored by the father, by Isaac. I hear the story of Isaac and Rebekah mentioned most often when preachers or somebody who is teaching a Bible class maybe is urging parents not to have favorites among their children. That seems to be the main lesson that we ought to draw, because Isaac definitely favored Esau because he was a man of the field. He hunted the wild things, made a wild game meal that Esau loved. And the Bible says at the same time that Rebekah loved or favored Jacob. And so the family was sort of divided, Esau and Isaac against Jacob and Rebekah. The Bible tells the story of how Isaac went over to the land of the Philistines. He went westward, in other words, toward the seacoast. And there was a king of the Philistines that is also mentioned when Abraham was in the land, a man by the name of Abimelech. Av in Hebrew means father, and so the phrase Abimelech means my father was a king. And so it was more of a title than the name. It is a king of the Philistines in Psalm 34 is called Abimelech, although when you read back through Samuel and Kings, there is a different king of the Philistines who is mentioned as interacting with the people of Israel. But Abimelech was a sort of like a title like Pharaoh. All of the Philistine kings for a certain time were called Abimelech. In other words, we deserve this office. We deserve to be king. We were born to be kings. And so my father was the king. In other words, they didn't have to fight a battle to decide who was going to be king, or in some other way come into the kingship. They were born to be kings. And so Isaac also, the story is a little different, but it's also the same in some instances. For example, Rebekah is a beautiful woman, as Sarah was. And Isaac is afraid that that they will kill him and take Rebekah to be the wife of some important official among the Philistines. And so he, like Abraham, says that Rebekah was his sister. Now, in the case of Abraham, Sarah was a half-sister, but there was no sister. They were related. Laban, the father of Rebekah, would mean that Laban was, I think, a cousin or something like that of Abraham, and so they were related, but not closely related. The king of the Philistines, Abimelech, learned that Rebekah was the wife of Isaac. And so it's careful to say in Genesis that he didn't touch her, that there wasn't anything going on. He just thought that she was a beautiful woman, and so that he no doubt planned to take her as a wife, but never did. And so Rebekah, and he rebuked Isaac, because Isaac had lied to him, because Isaac could have caused him a great deal of trouble if God had turned against him. And so he rebuked Isaac for lying to him about his wife and saying that it was his sister. But the story is much like the story of Abraham going down to the land of Egypt, and much like Abraham going over into the land of the Philistines. There is even a well, a famous well, no doubt, named Beersheba. The word Beer, B-E-E-R, in Hebrew means well, and so the well of the seven is what it means, Beersheba. And the well eventually fell to Isaac. It was Isaac's well, although there was dispute among the herdsmen of Isaac and Abimelech about who owned what and whose slaves or whose people had made what well. But the story is much the same when Abraham goes over into the land of the Philistines as when Isaac does. But Isaac and Rebekah, of course, what the Bible is concerned about is the son of promise. And so it tells about the birth of these two sons, how Esau was born first and then Jacob. Jacob is the second son. Like Isaac was the second son, the first son was Ishmael. And there's that theme of the second son that goes on through the book of Genesis. If we had time, we'd look at some other examples. But at least in these two, we can see that there's a second son involved. And the second son is the son of promise, whether it is Isaac or whether it is Jacob. The story goes on that Isaac has a birthright to bestow and a blessing. Now, I'm not sure I've got that all straightened out, but the way I understand it is that the birthright was something that came to a son by virtue of his order of birth. The only ones that were heirs of the father's goods were the male heirs. The women married men from other places and other tribes, and so it was assumed that their wealth came through their husbands. Now, again, I'm not trying to approve that, the practice, but that's simply the way the world worked in that day. In our own time, as a matter of fact, some of us are old enough to remember a time when women didn't inherit. I have some of my family where there was one male and a bunch of girls, 5 or 6 girls, and the one male got all of the inheritance, and then wasted it and squandered it. But all of that is beside the point. That's the way the ancient world worked, and it's the way our world worked for a long time. The a concubine's children, as I've said, received no inheritance. When Isaac was to receive all the inheritance, and then the Isaac and Rebekah had the 2 sons who were twins. Well, if things worked exactly like the law of Moses says, in Deuteronomy it says that the firstborn son is to have a double portion to carry on the farm or whatever property there might be. And so the son who was born first was Esau, and strictly by the law he should have received a double portion, the portion of the firstborn. But in addition to that, there was the blessing of the patriarch of the family. Somebody like Isaac gave his blessing to his favored ones. And so the favored one, the one who received the blessing, was not necessarily the same as the one who was firstborn. And at least that's the way I understand this. And so Isaac was getting to be an old man. He saw that he was to die soon, and he called his son, his favorite son, Esau, in and said, "Will you go into the field and kill a deer or kill some animal and make the kind of savory dish that I like? And when you do, I'll give you the inheritance, the right of the firstborn." Well, he went out hunting, but when he came back in, he was about to starve to death. He was very hungry. He was tired from being out in the wilderness and the desert. And I guess you have to see the desert of Judea. It was the southern part of the land of Israel. You have to see that area to understand how somebody could be starving to death or about to die of thirst. And so he came in and he asked Jacob if he could have a portion of that red stuff. My translation says red stuff. Many translations say it was red soup. I suppose, that's probably was some kind of soup. I don't know what was in it. It's later on called lentil soup, and so it may have been made of some kind of beans that gave it a red cast. The Bible mentions it even in Hebrews. It says that Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. And always the people of Israel looked upon Esau as being a kind of secular man. He was uninterested in the finer things of life, even uninterested in God. He was just interested in the animal nature, being alive, that's all. And so he said, what good is it going to be to me if I die here from thirst and hunger? What good is the birthright going to be to me? And so he sold his birthright to Jacob. So Jacob had half of what was to be the inheritance. He had the birthright of the oldest son. And then while Esau is going to make some savory dish for him to eat, Rebekah enters the story, and she calls Jacob aside, and she says, "Let me fix you up, sweetie." I don't know if she said sweetie, but something on that order. She said, "I'll fix you up so that you will receive the blessing of of your father." And so she she told him to go out into the stall and find 2 young goats that would make a good meal, and that she would prepare. She knew exactly what her husband, what Isaac liked. And she said, "I'll make what he wants, and you take it in and tell him that you're Esau." Well, Jacob, of course, thinks that through, and he says, "Well, he might touch my arms or my hands, and he'll see that I'm not hairy like my brother is." And Rebekah said, "I'll take care of that." And he said, "He will pull me down to give me a kiss of greeting. And when he does, he'll touch the nape of my neck, and he'll see that I'm not a hairy man." Rebekah said, "I'll take care of that too." And so when the goats were brought in, she took the skin of the goat and made a glove of some type for Jacob to wear, so that he would appear to remember that Isaac is an old man. And she also fixes something for the nape of his neck. And so Jacob goes in, and Isaac says, "Who is it? Who's talking to me?" And Jacob says, "It's your son, your firstborn. I am Esau." And Isaac says, "Well, you sound like Jacob, but you talk like and you feel like Esau." And so he touched his hands and his arms, and he touched the back of his neck. And he says, you have the feel and the smell. Rebekah also said, "I'll give you the clothes that Esau wears." And so Isaac said, "You have the smell, and you have everything that my son Esau has. But the voice is the voice of Jacob." But he was convinced, Isaac was convinced, that it was his son Esau, or that it was his son Esau that was before him. And so he gives, first of all, the blessing. And the blessing is given at some length. And he can't take it back once he has spoken it. The ancient people often thought of that. They thought of words as having a power of their own. You didn't have to explain them. You couldn't do anything to take them back. Once they had been spoken, they were sort of out there, and they had their own power to bring about what the words said. And so Isaac couldn't take the words back. But he gave a short blessing to Esau. But Jacob becomes then the heir of the kingdom, of the land. God, Yahweh, repeats the promise that he had given to Abraham a couple of times to Isaac. So then Isaac, later Esau or Jacob, has to escape to go back to the land across the river, across the Euphrates, where he gets his wives. Now, we'll talk about that next time. But the Bible doesn't have much to say about Isaac and Rebekah, certainly not as much as it has to say about Abraham, and not even as much as it has to say about Jacob and Joseph. When Jacob and Joseph is divided into 2 stories, they still come out to be longer. There's more space given to them than is given to Isaac. Isaac doesn't have much space. And so apparently it was Abraham and Jacob, Israel. His name was changed to Israel. Jacob, Israel, who became the people those that the people of God remembered, especially as their ancestor. Thank you for the attention today, and next time we will go into the 12 sons of Jacob and Jacob's coming back into the land of Canaan.